All right, welcome back to part two of the personality unit. So we finished up by just doing a brief little description of Maslow's idea of self-actualization, gave a few examples, ended with Malala Yousaf. Um yeah, okay, so moving on. Some of the criticisms that Maslow had against, or some of the criticisms against Maslow and the humanistic perspective. Just like with Freud, this humanistic approach is difficult to test or validate scientifically. These are theories that are really broad and abstract, and Maslow never really concerned himself with creating testable theories. So if a theory is untestable, it's unscientific, and it's from a scientific perspective, it's actually useless. So that was one of the big criticisms, was that this humanistic approach is just a little too wishy-washy, a little too nebulous to really be considered a scientific idea. And then I've already alluded to this, but self-actualization is poorly defined. If this is the ultimate goal of human behavior in our lifetime, what is it? It seems like it means too many different things to be a well-defined term for scientific purposes. And then also, going back to the hierarchy of needs, it's not always the case that people proceed up this hierarchy in a linear fashion. What I mean by that is physiological needs are not always met in people who accomplish great things. Some people who don't have food, water, warmth, shelter, clothing on a regular basis still go on to accomplish great things in life. So that shouldn't be the way things happen according to the hierarchy of needs. And another example, sometimes physiological needs are ignored for other needs. Think of people going on hunger strikes. They're refusing to have their hunger needs met in order to achieve a higher order goal, like a self-esteem goal or prestige goal. So the hierarchy of needs doesn't seem to be as strict as Maslow originally thought it was. And then lastly, just like Freud was maybe a little too pessimistic about human nature, Maslow is a little too optimistic about human nature. Again, just like Freud only focusing on the bad side of human nature, Maslow was only focusing on the good side of human nature. Okay, so we briefly touched on the psychoanalytic approach with Freud, the humanistic approach with Maslow, and now we're going to finish up with more modern approaches like the trait approach. So the trait approach is kind of summarized as the description and measurement of personality differences. All right, what in the world does that mean? So trait and type theories, this is kind of where the field is at right now. A trait is a relatively stable predisposition to behave in a certain way. So relatively stable predisposition to behave in a certain way. And we have two different types of traits. We have surface traits and source traits. A surface trait is a characteristic that can be inferred from observable behavior. So this is something that we observe on the surface of behavior. You can observe a surface trait simply by watching someone. A source trait is what we are actually interested in personality research. A source trait is the most fundamental dimension of personality, and there's relatively few source traits. These relatively few source traits, these are the true underlying causes of behavior in our minds. A surface trait, there's many surface traits. These are more situation specific. Source traits are situation general. All right, we'll talk more about that in the slides here. And I also want to make a distinction between a trait and a state. So a trait is long lasting. It is evident across different situations. whereas a state is temporary and it is evident in specific situations. So a trait is what we're interested in. A state is something that we're not interested in. And this can make personality research very difficult. So for example, if you observe someone and they're acting very angry, and you have to determine, okay, is that a temporary state? Are they just angry today because something happened, like they spilled coffee on themselves to start the day? Or is that a trait? Are they actually an angry person? Are they angry in many other situations in their life? That's the goal of personality research, is to kind of separate these traits and states. And it's very difficult to measure because a lot of personality research relies on self-report. We rely on people telling us whether or not it's a state or a trait. So it's very difficult because people aren't always the best judges of their own behavior. Okay, so if traits are the goal of personality research, what is a trait? Let's talk a little bit more about that. So we like to think of traits as a continuum. Not an either or situation. So if you're looking at something like introversion, we don't think about someone being an introvert and someone not. So we don't have someone who's an introvert and someone who's an extrovert. We think of introversion and extroversion as a sliding scale. It's a continuum. Everyone has a little bit of extrovert in them and everyone has a little bit of introvert in them. Some people more so than others, some people less so than others. We all fall somewhere on that continuum of introvert to extrovert. Again, it's not an either or. And you can do this with any other trait. Openness to experience on one side of the continuum, risk avoidance on the other side of the continuum. We don't have risk takers and risk avoiders. We have everyone on this planet falls somewhere on that continuum. They have uh, they have characteristics of both. All right, let's also talk about validity and reliability. These are two important terms, and if you've taken a statistics course or you plan to take a statistics course, you're definitely going to see these terms quite a bit. So validity and reliability, they are related, but they are different things. We're going to start with validity. If a measure, if a test is valid, it means that we are measuring what we think we are measuring. We are measuring what the test intended to measure. So shoe size would not be a valid measure of intelligence. If you say that, this person has a shoe size of 10, that means that they're very smart. Well, that's not a valid measurement at all. If you use an IQ test to measure intelligence, that is going to be much more valid. An IQ test does a much better job of measuring intelligence than shoe size does. Yes, there are problems with IQ tests, but undeniably, it's a better measure of intelligence than shoe size. So that's validity. Are we measuring what we think we're measuring? Reliability is, are our measurements consistent? So if we give that IQ test time and time again, is it consistently showing us the same IQ, or at least very similar IQ numbers? Because remember, traits are long lasting. Personality traits, they change over the lifetime, but very slowly and just in very small ways. We like to think of source traits as long lasting, so they should be reliable. We should get similar measures of a particular trait across time. So this is where it gets a little difficult to tease these two apart, because shoe size is actually a very reliable measure of intelligence, meaning if you were to measure someone's shoe size 10 times in one day, and then the day after, and then a week after, and then a year after, you're going to get the same measurement, meaning it's very consistent. It's a very reliable measure. It's just not a valid measure. So hopefully this image here helps explain validity and reliability a little bit more. So on the far left part of this image, we've got the target with arrows being shot. This is an example of high validity, high reliability. We're aiming right where we're aiming, we're measuring what we think we're measuring, and we're pretty consistent. They're all on that red bullseye. Moving to the right, the next one here has high validity but low reliability. Every arrow is on the target, but it's not very reliable. They're not very consistent measurements. So we are measuring what we think we're measuring, but it's not a very reliable measure, not very consistent measurements. Next one, low validity, high reliability. This is our shoe size measuring intelligence example. Yes, we've got very nice grouping of the arrows here, very consistent measures, but you can see they're way off target. So they're not measuring what we think we're measuring at all. And then this last one here, low validity and low reliability. The arrows are all over the place and not a single one is on target. So two different dimensions here. Both are important for personality measurements. Excuse me. All right, so how many traits are there? Well, there are potentially thousands. And at any given time in psychology history, hundreds and hundreds of traits have been proposed. In reality, any adjective could be considered a trait, depending on how you argue it. But think about these different adjectives listed here: angry, violent, hostile, rage, irritated, acrimony, fury. But we have to ask ourselves, at what point are these traits overlapping on the same source trait? How different are the traits of anger and violence? How different are the traits of hostility and anger? How different are the traits of acrimony and anger? There has to be a lot of overlap of these types of adjectives that are very similar. So one way we can think about this is, what traits explain the most variability in the population with the smallest amount of overlap without stepping on each other's toes? And now we turn to the big five. The big five personality traits listed there, they do the best job of explaining the most amount of variability in human behavior with the smallest amount of overlap. And they are conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion. We're going to go through each of these individually, and a great way to remember them is that they spell out the word canoe, or you can rearrange them so they spell out the word ocean. All right, let's start with conscientiousness. What is conscientiousness? This is self-discipline. People who are high on conscientiousness, they make a lot of plans, they're very organized, and they have a high need for achievement. But remember, these are not neither or traits. You're not a conscientious person or you're not. This is a continuum. So some people are more conscientious than others, but we're all on this continuum. We all have these traits to some extent. So two fictional examples for this trait would be the dude from The Big Lebowski. This would be an example of someone who is very low in conscientiousness, not very self-disciplined, no plans, unorganized, very, very low need for achievement. Someone who would score very high on the conscientiousness scale is Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter series. Very self-disciplined, lots of planning, lots of organization, high need for achievement. Next up is agreeableness. So agreeableness, kind of just like it sounds, people who are very agreeable, they tend to be very honest, very helpful, very trustworthy, very friendly. And two fictional examples, you've got the Grinch on one end of the continuum, and then you've got Kenneth Parcell from 30 Rock on the other end of the continuum. Neuroticism. Neuroticism is your tendency to experience negative emotions. So people who are high on neuroticism tend to experience a lot of negative emotions. People who are low on neuroticism do not tend to experience negative emotions. So someone who is high on the neuroticism scale is stressed a lot, they give up easily, they're anxious and worrisome. You might describe them as very moody. Someone who kind of meets that definition would be Charlie Brown from the Peanuts series. And someone who would be very low on the neuroticism scale would maybe be Obi-Wan Kenobi from the Star Wars series. Next up, we have the O in canoe, openness to experience. So openness to experience, again, it's kind of just like it sounds. People who are very high on this scale, they have a vivid imagination, they're very curious, they're adventurous, and oftentimes this is correlated with high level of drug use. Some examples of people who might be high on the openness to experience scale: Albert Einstein. I'm not saying anything about his drug use. I do not know anything about his drug use or lack thereof. And someone who might score very low on this scale would be Spock from the Star Trek series. And our last big five trait is E, extroversion. So extroversion, the people who are high on this scale, they enjoy social gatherings, they're bored when they're alone, and they seek out social interaction. It's kind of a need that they have to interact with people socially. Our two fictional examples here, we've got Austin Powers on the high end of the extroversion scale, and then Edward Scissorhands on the other end of the scale. So those are the big five, and these, we're going to jump back here. These five traits, again, they explain the most amount of human behavior, human variability, with the smallest amount of overlap between the different traits. So it seems like these five traits do a pretty good job of explaining human personality. If you know where someone falls on these five different continuums, then that explains a lot of who they are as a person. All right, so let's talk about how we measure things like personality traits, because this is kind of the end goal here. We make all these fancy psychological theories, and then we want to test these fancy psychological theories, and we want to make predictions with them, and we want to describe and understand and explain people's behavior with them. And one way we do that is through tests. There are literally hundreds of personality uh, tests. There are literally hundreds of different types of tests, even. But at the end of the day, a test is useful if it achieves two basic goals. Number one, it accurately and consistently reflects a person's characteristics on some dimension. That's our validity and reliability. The test is useful if it's valid, and it's useful if it's reliable. Number two, it must predict a person's future psychological functioning or behavior. So remember, that's one of the big reasons why we're interested in personality in the first place. We want to be able to predict future behavior, future cognitive functioning. So if we can do these two things, then it's a useful test. So let's start with a very famous personality test. This is the Myers-Briggs. This is something that employers use quite extensively. It uses something called the types approach, and unfortunately, this is not a scientifically valid test. This is based on Carl Jung's philosophy. Carl Jung was a psychoanalyst slash philosopher, and he made a bunch of theories, and he never psychologically tested them. He never scientifically tested them in any sort of concrete way. However, the Myers-Briggs personality test or personality inventory is helpful. it's often used as a team building experience. So new employees take the Myers-Briggs test and they compare and contrast, like, oh, I scored this, I scored this, I scored this, I'm this type, I'm this type. How would we interact? What it does is it gets people talking about themselves. It gets people interacting and learning about people that they're going to be working with. So it's not a useless test, but it's just not a scientifically valid test. Another one that you may not have heard of, this is the MMPI. This is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. This is a beast of a test, and this is the most widely used self-report personality inventory out there. Originally, it was designed to assess mental health and detect psychological symptoms. Just like when we were talking about IQ tests, it was meant to differentiate between healthy people and people who might benefit from some sort of other intervention. So, like I said, it's an absolute beast. It has over 1,000 questions. 500 of those questions are true or false. 500 of them are multiple choice questions. They kind of just bombard you with all these questions, thinking that you might try to make yourself look good at first, but after a while, you'll just get so bored and so sick that you'll actually start being honest later on in the test. It's a beast. If you ever have to take it, I do feel sorry for you. Okay, so like I said, the MMPI is a self-report questionnaire, self-report personality inventory. So let's talk about the strengths of self-reports, because earlier on in the lecture we talked about the difficulties, but let's talk about the strengths. So they're standardized, meaning each person receives the same instructions and they respond to the same questions. So we can compare and contrast different people's responses. That's what I mean by standardized. We can compare results across people. And self-reports also allow us to establish norms, meaning that results of one person can be compared to previously established averages. So we don't have to subjectively evaluate someone's responses. We can compare them to the group average. But the weakness of self-reports, and we already touched on this at the beginning of lecture, people can fake their responses to look better in certain ways. People want to think that they're good people, so they might try to score high on like an altruism behavior scale, might score or try to score low on an aggressiveness scale. Oftentimes, just like with the MMPI, these tests contain hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items, and they can become very boring and very tedious, and the person loses interest very, very quickly. And then lastly, people are just not the best judges of their own behavior. Oftentimes with self-report, you'll get questions like, how stressed have you been in the last 2 weeks? Well, what we often find is that people will report their stress level based on their current in the moment stress level. So if you are stressed in that moment, you might think that, yeah, I have been pretty stressed out the last 2 weeks, even though, you had a pretty easy, carefree last 2 weeks, but your thinking, your memory of it is tainted by your emotional state in that moment. So, like I said, we're just not a very good judge of our own behavior. All right, so we're going to move into some kind of miscellaneous items here before we finish up the personality lecture. And we're going to talk about some ways not to measure personality. And we're going to start with astrology. This is an idea that has been around for tens of thousands of years. The idea that there are cosmic influences on our personality based on the month of our birth. And the short answer here is that there is absolutely no scientific evidence to support this idea whatsoever. Scientists have looked, they absolutely have tried to find that evidence, but it just doesn't exist. The tiniest little piece of evidence that was found was that when it comes to personality, people born between the months of December and February had a slightly, very, very slightly lower agreeableness scale measure. So there was statistical significance, but no one would call this practical significance. And that those two terms there, statistical significance versus practical significance, I'm not going to explain those here, but that's something that you'll come across in a statistics course. So this finding, it means something for like a statistical standpoint, but in the real world, it's not like you can just go around and find people and based on how they act, you're like, oh, you must have been born in January because you have very low agreeableness. It's not a very powerful effect at all. So the reason for this is, or at least the thinking for this statistical significance here, was that there's slightly less sunshine during those months, and that's kind of the last phase of pregnancy. So if you're giving birth during those months, you're exposed to less sunlight. You have less vitamin D in your body, meaning the child or the fetus has less vitamin D, which can lead to some differences in cognitive development. And we see the exact opposite effect in the southern hemisphere. So the opposite months. So that would be June, July, and August, I believe. If children are born in the southern hemisphere during those months, we also see that slight statistical significance. This finding was discovered in one study, but it has not been replicated, which is always a big red flag in science circles. And like I said before, many, many studies have looked for these astrology influences on behavior, and they have not found them. All right, moving on. How about birth order? Well, this is an idea that it's depending on if you're the firstborn, secondborn, youngest, middle child, oldest, that's going to have a huge influence on your personality. This is an idea originally put forth by Alfred Adler, and his idea was that it had an enormous influence on who you were as a person in later life. It's been largely discredited. Again, there's a tiny kernel of truth here. It does have a very small effect on IQ, but again, it's that difference between statistical significance and practical significance. Yes, it's statistically significant. Is it a practical difference? Definitely not. And the idea here is that there's differences in resource distribution. Older children, oldest children tend to get more resources than younger children in most families. Middle children tend to get the least. This idea still persists in pop psychology, even though, again, there's very, very little interesting science to back it up. And then lastly, I just like to briefly mention these. The Rorschach test, that's that ink blot test that you might be familiar with. The idea that you look at an ink blot and what you see in it can tell you, what kind of person you are. No evidence to back that up. Free association, this is the idea that, I give you a word and you tell me what it makes you think of. Not a whole lot of evidence to back that up either. And graphology, I like this idea, graphology. This is the idea that I can tell a little bit about your personality based on the angle of your handwriting. So you can see that little image there. And we've actually got, depending on the severity of the angle, that is part of who you are. And that's scientifically valid. Absolutely not. And then I like this. Yeah, there's actually people that write the back way. They slant their words the other way. Anyway, that is not a scientifically supported idea whatsoever. That's all I have for personality. And thanks for listening.